China's controversial one-child policy has come to an end. Introduced in 1979 to limit the birth rate in the world's most populous country, it's said to have prevented 400 million births. But now, amid a rapidly ageing population, the government is abolishing the policy. With me to discuss is Kerry Brown from Chatham House. So Kerry, had the one-child policy not been put in place, where do you think China would be now?
The birth rate in China, in fact, was falling quite dramatically before it was ever kind of sort of put in place. So births in China in 1970 were 6 per family. In 1979 it went down to 2.5. So there is an academic debate in China about whether it's actually been that effective as a policy. But it's always been associated with the reform and opening up, sort of perceived by some as being interference of the state in family life. So the fact that it's been relaxed, I mean, it hasn't gone away because it's now 2 per family, is symbolically important.
Of course, easing this policy will have financial implications, of course, if people do decide to have more children, because China's health industry is already overburdened in terms of maternity care and that sort of thing. So how do you think that will affect the country?
China's a continental-sized economy, so in Shanghai, I imagine there'll be enough people with the money to have a second child. And I mean, they already could. There are always a lot of exceptions, and those with enough money could always pay the fines. So it's been a very unevenly kind of imposed policy. For people in cities, the main issue really is it's very expensive now in China to have space in cities. Shanghai is more expensive than probably London, and so that will be the big problem. If you can have an extra kid, well, that's good, but who's going to pay for the extra room and who's going to pay for the extra cost?
You actually mentioned fines, and I think it said that the Chinese government have collected upwards of 2 trillion yuan since the 1980s. So do you think this has almost monetized the reproductive urge in China?
They will join the club then, because reproduction is monetized everywhere. The problem is that China's got a tax system which is pretty primitive in some ways. It's not like personal taxation is the main source of government revenue. It's state enterprises, and you don't really have a system to incentivize people through tax breaks and through other kind of fiscal policies. So this will involve eventually, I suspect, all of that, and that's a great political battle, and it leads to big kind of issues whether Chinese people will want to have tax and taxation imposed on them in very different ways than the ways they do now, without having representation.
China's massive population, of course, helped China claim the title of factory of the world. And of course, its economic strength came from an abundance of cheap workforce. So as the country is seeing a slowdown of late, how much of this do you think could be linked to the one-child policy?
Well, there's big structural reasons why the Chinese economy is slowing down. Firstly, because it's very hard to maintain high levels of growth for a long period, and China's already done that in ways which have been described by some as miraculous. Cheap labour was a source in the past of China being a big manufacturer. You said earlier, China being the manufacturer, the factory of the world. But I think that story is coming to an end. And I mean, that's the story the Chinese people want to come to an end too. They don't want to work in factories creating iPhones that sort of they get about 3 cents out of every dollar. However, I don't think they want the growth rate to fall in such a way like it has in Japan, where you have for every person retired only sort of 2 or 3 people supporting them.
Now, Kerry, how much impact do you think abolishing the one-child policy will actually have? Because of the mindset in China, it's so ingrained now that they can only have one child. So do you think they will bother with it that much?
The thing about the Xi Jinping sort of style of leadership is there are bold moves, but there's always got to be kind of patient policy follow-up and patient implementation. And I would imagine for economic reasons there will not be a big sort of spike in births. I don't think that will happen. Chinese people live in great kind of economic sort of constraint at the moment through all sorts of costs and housing costs, living costs on their lives. There is a sort of phenomena of young people living with their parents deep into their 30s, even after they get married, because they can't afford to get their own place and they can't afford to rent. Well, in that context, having 1 or 2 children is just not going to make economic sense. The biggest contraceptive in China now is economic reality.
Well, one thing about the one-child policy is it has sort of created this little emperor syndrome. So how do you think that mindset has shaped the leaders, the CEOs in China?
I mean, it's pretty clear that the generation that are coming into sort of mid-career now, Xi Jinping, for instance, who's in his 60s, I mean, he went through the Cultural Revolution, he went through a period of kind of quite big privation, didn't sort of really get any schooling until he went to Tsinghua as an engineering student in the mid-70s. So that mindset is very different to people now, maybe the sort of 1.5 million that have been abroad, studied, many of them have gone back. They have a big sense of entitlement. I mean, they've had everything, really. It's a big difference between generations. There's always generational differences in societies, but in China, I think the generational difference is very dramatic.
And if siblings become the norm, do you think then that perhaps the way businesses are run perhaps will change?
The pattern of businesses in diaspora communities or in Hong Kong and Taiwan is family businesses. One of the anomalies about People's Republic of China is it's state enterprises, and you get small entrepreneurs, yes, and those are emerging, but they are still only part of the economy. And in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, I mean, the entrepreneurship and the family-run businesses are the heart of the economy. So I imagine you will see the emergence of family-run businesses. You've got a generation of entrepreneurs now in mainland China who've been very, very successful, and they will probably pass on to their children. I mean, people like Jack Ma and others, they'll probably want to pass on their business to their children, but that's a long way in the future.
Women in boardrooms, of course, is a massive issue in the West at the moment, and the one-child policy in China did see couples favouring male children. So do you think this will ease up slightly and we'll see more women in a few years in leading positions, or do you think it could have a worse effect for women in business in China in terms of companies seeing them as taking too much time off for maternity, that sort of thing?
In terms of the political realm, it's pretty grim. So only 20% of the members of the Communist Party, 87 million members, are women. In the current Politburo Standing Committee, no women. In the Politburo, I think 2 women. Since 1949, only 2 governors of Chinese provinces have been women. But actually in company life, not state enterprises, but in entrepreneurship, women are well represented. I mean, I think something like 30% of senior leaders of non-state companies are women. So in that sense, the emergence of a sort of non-state or private sector in China has been empowering, economically empowering for women, and I think that will be a trend that continues. Politically, I don't think there's a great likelihood of seeing a Chinese version of Hillary Clinton anytime soon.
So overall, you don't see the abolishment of the one-child policy being the silver bullet for China's economy?
No, I think it's going to take way, way, way more than that.